Hello, viewers. Today I want to talk about false start in Zimbabwe. This is going to be a very long topic, so I may not be allowed to do it in one shot. So I will make it in phases. So today I will talk about phase one. What is phase one? I always want to get into historical perspectives so that from our history, we can learn quite a lot about our present and our future. Now, let me start with the liberation struggle itself. Now, there were four forces that were involved in the liberation struggle. Two were political parties, and the other two were the revolutionary armies. The Zimbabwe African National Union and the Zimbabwe African People's Union were the political parties. ZAPU was led by Joshua Nkomo, and ZANU was led by Robert Mugabe. But you'll also see that these were political structures modeled along the Western type of system. So, you can also see that the structures of the political parties based in Maputo and Lusaka respectively were quite different from the structures of the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army. They were two different things. The only link that was there between the political parties and the liberation movements was their commanders. Their commanders are the ones who actually carried messages from the liberation war, freedom fighters, and the political party structures in Maputo and Lusaka, respectively. Now, I want to look at the liberation movement itself. Now, you'll see that Zanla and Zipra entirely dependent on the spirit mediums for their success in the war. For me, religion is the highest magnitude of a people's culture. So, for the freedom fighters to execute a successful war, they had to resort to religion. Zanla invoked the spirit of Mbuyanyanda, and they sought for guidance from spirit mediums before they launched an attack on the enemy. And this went on for a long time until when they were successful, when they forced Smith to start negotiating for an internal settlement and eventually for the Lancaster House Conference. In fact, through our religion, the freedom fighters had actually succeeded in forcing the enemy to do the unthinkable. One would then have expected that the delegation, the leaders of the delegation that went to Geneva and then later on to Lancaster House, should have been the commanders of the liberation movements, the liberation armies, the commanders who actually had direct contact with the actually people who staged the revolution, who staged the war, the people who were actually in contact with the majority population in Zimbabwe. I know for certain Zanla did it through Pungwes. Pungwes were overnight meetings that were held by the freedom fighters and the communities. So, the people who should have led the delegations at these conferences should have been Tongo Gara, Lookout Masuku, and Davengwa. These were the people who should lead the delegation. These were the people who should have been the principal speakers, the principal negotiators at these conferences. Why do I say that? I say that because they would have been able to express the wishes of the liberation freedom fighters. I am very sure that the liberation armies would not have agreed to the sort of agreement that the politicians reached at the Lancaster House agreement, which was a complete sellout of what they were fighting for. We know for certain that over and over again, Tongo Gara preached the gospel that Zanla was not fighting against the white men, but that they were fighting against the system over and over again. So, what was the negotiation at Lancaster? The negotiation at Lancaster was about the removal of the white man, but preserving his system and preserving his privileges. I am very sure that the liberation fighters would not have agreed to such an arrangement. And to make matters worse, the arrangement made General Walls the commander of the joint forces, modeled along the Rhodesian army pattern. Everything else was Rhodesian. There was nothing Zimbabwean. Even if you go to the Central Intelligence Organization, it also had to have as its director Ken Flower, a Rhodesian. And these guys had to resign later on, not because of anything, but because they would not stand a situation whereby their Minister of Defense would be a black man And their Minister of Security would also be a black man. So that is probably what led them to resign. But the system was the same. There was no change whatsoever. We even had, as our Minister of Finance, one David Smith. And we had the Normans, we had the Steps. All these were white men who were actually perpetuating the system within the so-called African government. I have said religion is the highest magnitude of a people's culture. Our religion did not in any way allow the spilling of blood of another human being, particularly African against African. That is why there was the institution of Ngozi. Ngozi, which was the spirit of the dead rising against the person who had killed them. And Ngozi had to be appeased. And this affected the whole family of the person who would have committed the bloodshed. So I also see something wrong in our trying to solve the Gukurahundi problem. Issuing of birth certificates or death certificates is not the way to appease the dead people that we killed. In any case, there was no need. It was not necessary. It should not have happened at all. Because if it were not because of the system, and there was unity between Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, they could have talked to the dissidents. They could have opened a dialogue with the dissidents, tried to see what their grievances were and how those grievances would be met. That should have avoided the war. But we decided to follow the system that we had been used to, the system that the Rhodesian forces were used to. The Rhodesian regime was used to. And opposition must be met with force and brutal force. We know that. The Rhodesian forces used to wipe out whole villages because they were perceived to be supporting the freedom fighters. And it was the same method that was used in Matabeleland and the Midlands. Villages were wiped out because they were perceived to be supporting the dissidents. And again, during the liberation struggle, there were quite a number of people who were killed by the freedom fighters. And these were killed because they were perceived to be collaborating with Rhodesian forces. and some of them were very brutally killed. So you see, we have Ngozi amongst the Shonas and Ngozi amongst the Ndeveles. And how do we go about solving this problem? We would have to go back to our spirit mediums to guide us in as much as they guided us during the Liberation War on how to appease the spirit of Ngozi for so many of these people. There were certain rules and regulations that had to be followed when appeasing the Ngozi. And if we don't do that, then we don't know what is inflicting us. Let me remind you again that insofar as I am concerned, religion is the highest magnitude of a people's culture. So there is no way we can run away from our religion. We have once invoked the spirit of the mediums. Why don't we invoke the spirit of the mediums now to see how we can appease the Ngozi that we inflicted upon ourselves by going against our culture? It is against our culture to kill another fellow African, to shed the blood of another fellow African. And we are even still doing it right now. So we will have to invoke the spirit of the spirit mediums through our chiefs. And they will guide us on exactly what to do in Matabeleland and in Mashonaland. There is so much Ngozi around us. We cannot deny that. What happened to the spirit of all these people that we slaughtered in cold blood? Under the guise of gaining independence and preserving independence, which eventually ended up not independence at all. Because independence would have meant a complete change of the status quo, a complete change of the system, coming up with our own system, like what other nations have done, except the Africans. You know, the system is so bad that even after Lancaster, when we got the independence, we could not even build institutions to deal with post-war distress. We could not even build institutions to deal with the war disabled, the war maimed, even welfare institutions to look after those freedom fighters who could not be accommodated in the Rhodesian army led by General Walls. They also suffered post-trauma stress whatever. Even when we decided to give out what was called demobilization funds, that was also corruptly done. We should actually not have given those demobilization funds to the freedom fighters. We should have built institutions like what I've just mentioned, to deal with them so that they don't become paupers. And indeed, quite a number died paupers, even being stigmatized by the communities in which they lived. Because according to our religion, anybody who spills the blood of another African has got a stigma around him or her. So even that demobilization fund was tainted with a lot of corruption. Politicians saw some ways of enriching themselves, and they indeed enriched themselves. I know for certain that the director of the DMOB had enough funds even to buy a farm in Goromonzi. I know that. I was not a confident onlooker. I was quite interested. That was part of my research of how our independence was being carried out. So we have got a problem in that we had a false start. Next time I will talk about other issues of false start. I will go to the extent of talking about even the law that the so-called independent Zimbabwe had to follow the Roman Dutch law, as if there were Romans and Dutch in Zimbabwe. And up to now, it is the Roman Dutch law. We had a false start. We have to find the meaning of our independence. Define exactly what independence means. If it does not mean a complete change of the status quo, then for me, that is not independence at all. Again, this is the voice in the wilderness, but the voice of true revolution. I thank you. See you in my next video.